February 1943. A Spitfire pilot climbs to 18,000 feet over the English Channel. His canopy fogs from the inside. He can't see the enemy. He can't see his wingman. He rolls hard left, trusting instinct, and nearly collides with his own squadron. 3 pilots died that week, not from bullets, from blindness. One man believed the problem wasn't the weather, it was the design, and he was about to break every rule to prove it. The winter of 1943 is brutal over Northern Europe. RAF Fighter Command operates in air so cold that moisture from a pilot's breath turns cockpit glass opaque within seconds. It happens during climbs. It happens during dives. It happens when adrenaline spikes and breathing quickens, right when clarity matters most. Pilots call it the White Death. Not dramatic, just accurate. You can't dogfight what you can't see. You can't navigate home through clouds if your instruments are invisible. You can't bail out if you don't know which way is up. Standard procedure is to crack the canopy. Let the freezing slipstream rush in. It clears the fog in seconds, but it also turns the cockpit into a wind tunnel at 300 miles per hour. Temperatures inside drop to 20 below zero. Fingers stiffen. Oxygen masks ice over. Frostbite becomes routine. Some pilots fly the entire mission with canopies open. They return with faces raw, eyes bloodshot, speech slurred from cold. Ground crews wrap them in blankets and walk them to the medical tent. Flight surgeons log it as cold exposure. Command logs it as acceptable loss. But the numbers don't lie. Between December 1942 and March 1943, Fighter Command records 37 incidents of spatial disorientation attributed to canopy fogging. 11 result in crashes, 8 in mid-air collisions, the rest in aborted intercepts, missed kills, and bombers getting through. Enemy pilots know this. Luftwaffe intelligence briefs its crews on RAF cold weather vulnerability. German fighters bait Spitfires into climbs, then vanish into cloud. They wait for the British to lose visual reference, to panic, to make mistakes. It's not a tactic, it's exploitation. Engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment try everything. They test anti-fog paste. It smears. They try heated glass. It cracks. They install ventilation ducts. They freeze shut. Every solution adds weight, complexity, or failure points. None of them work under combat conditions. Pilots adapt. They breathe shallow. They tilt their heads to see through clear patches. They memorize instrument layouts so they can fly blind. It's resourceful. It's courageous. It's also insane. At RAF Tangmere, a maintenance officer named Peter Holloway watches pilot after pilot return from sorties shaking, exhausted, frostbitten. He's not a designer. He's not an aerodynamicist. He's a career ground crew officer who started as a rigger, worked his way up through hydraulics and fuel systems, and now oversees a squadron's daily airworthiness. His job is to keep 30 fighters mission ready. And right now, the biggest threat to readiness isn't enemy fire. It's condensation. He starts asking questions. Why does the canopy fog? Because warm, moist air from the cockpit meets cold glass. Why is the air moist? Because pilots exhale water vapor. Why can't it vent? Because cockpits are sealed for pressurization and aerodynamics. Why not just leave a gap? Because open canopies cause drag, turbulence, and hypothermia. The logic is circular. Every fix creates a new problem. Holloway begins to suspect the real issue isn't ventilation or heating, it's airflow. The cockpit is fighting itself. Warm air rising, cold air sinking, moisture trapped in between. He walks the flight line at dawn, watching ground crews prepare aircraft. He notices something. When canopies are slid back on the ground, a thin line of frost forms along the interior rail where cold metal meets warm air. It's a boundary, a threshold. He wonders if the same thing happens in flight, but faster and all over the glass. He starts sketching. Not formal blueprints, just ideas. What if you could control the boundary? What if you could direct cockpit air so it never stagnated against the glass? What if instead of sealing the canopy perfectly, you introduced a calculated leak? A small, controlled gap that allowed just enough cold air in to prevent fogging, but not enough to freeze the pilot? It sounds simple, maybe too simple, but Holloway has spent 15 years watching what works and what doesn't. He knows that elegant solutions are usually the ones that align with physics instead of fighting it. He takes the idea to his commanding officer. The response is polite but firm. The canopy design has been tested and approved. Modifications require authorization from the Air Ministry. Unauthorized alterations to airframes are a court-martial offense. If he wants to propose a change, there's a process. Forms, committees, trials. It will take months. Holloway thanks him and walks back to the hangar. He knows what months mean. More pilots, more crashes, more coffins. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Peter Holloway was born in 1908 in Coventry, in the shadow of the motor works. His father built engines for Daimler. His uncle worked the floor at Armstrong Siddeley. The family spoke in tolerances and torque specs over dinner. By the time Peter was 12, he could disassemble a magneto and explain why timing mattered. He didn't finish school, not because he couldn't, but because the family needed income and the factories needed hands. At 14, he was an apprentice rigger at Hawker's Canbury Park facility. He learned to tension fabric over airframes, to read grain in wood, to feel when a turnbuckle was tight enough but not too tight. It wasn't academic, it was tactile. If you got it wrong, someone died. He was good at it, methodical, patient. He didn't talk much, but he noticed everything. By 18, he was lead rigger on Hart biplanes. By 23, he'd moved into hydraulics. He understood systems, the way pressure moves through lines, the way fluids behave under temperature swings, the way a single choked valve can cripple an aircraft. When war broke out, Holloway enlisted immediately. The RAF needed maintainers more than pilots, and he was assigned to Tangmere as a flight sergeant. By 1941, he was a warrant officer. By 1943, he was maintenance officer for an entire squadron responsible for airworthiness, repairs, and troubleshooting under impossible conditions. He never sought rank. He sought solutions. He had a reputation for fixing things that shouldn't be fixable: cracked engine mounts, jammed gun breeches, hydraulic leaks that stumped factory engineers. He didn't use manuals, he used logic. His workshop was organized chaos. Shelves stacked with salvaged parts, workbenches covered in sketches and calipers, a battered copy of Herner's Fluid Dynamics text, annotated in pencil. He read it at night, by lamplight, while other officers played cards or wrote letters. Pilots liked him. He didn't salute much. He didn't lecture. If you came to him with a complaint, stick too stiff, rudder too loose, compass drift, he listened, nodded, and fixed it. He treated aircraft like patients. Every symptom had a cause. Every cause had a solution. But the fogging problem gnawed at him. It wasn't a broken part. It wasn't a faulty seal. It was a fundamental design flaw, and design flaws were the hardest to fix because they were built into every airframe. You couldn't just swap a component. You had to rethink the whole system. He started spending his evenings in the cockpit of a grounded Spitfire. He'd sit there for hours, breathing, watching condensation form, tracking where it started and how it spread. He noticed that it always began at the top of the canopy, where curvature was greatest and airflow slowest. It crept downward in a veil, thickest near the frame, thinner in the center. He tested temperature. He held a thermometer against the glass at different points. The top panels were coldest, the side panels slightly warmer. The center, where the pilot's head blocked interior air, stayed clearest longest. That told him something. The fogging wasn't uniform. It followed predictable patterns. He began to hypothesize. If you could direct warm cockpit air across the glass in a thin, fast-moving layer, it would prevent moisture from condensing before it could vent. But you couldn't use a heater. They'd tried that. You couldn't use fans. They'd tried that too. You needed passive airflow, something that worked with the aircraft's speed, not against it. His idea was deceptively simple. Cut a narrow gap along the base of the canopy, just behind the windscreen. Let slipstream air enter in a controlled stream. Shape the interior surface so that air flowed upward, across the glass, and vented out through the existing rear cockpit gaps. It would create a curtain of moving air, too fast for moisture to settle. The gap would need to be small, maybe a quarter inch. Any larger, and you'd get turbulence, noise, and cold. Any smaller, and you wouldn't move enough air. The placement would be critical. Too far forward and slipstream pressure would blast the pilot. Too far back and the air wouldn't reach the glass. It wasn't a major modification. It was a surgical one. A single cut, a shaped deflector. Maybe an hour of work. But it wasn't authorized, and that made it dangerous, not to the aircraft, but to Holloway's career. He thought about submitting a formal proposal, filling out the forms, waiting for review. But he also thought about the pilot who'd come in that morning, hands still shaking, describing how he'd lost his section leader in cloud because his canopy had turned to milk. Holloway made a decision. He wouldn't ask permission. He'd prove the concept first, then present the results. If it worked, they'd forgive him. If it didn't, he'd take the consequences. He chose a Spitfire Mark VB that was grounded for hydraulic repairs. It wouldn't fly for 3 days, which gave him time. He worked at night, alone, using a jeweler's saw and a set of files. He cut a slot along the canopy rail, smoothed the edges, and fabricated a small aluminum deflector to guide the airflow upward. When he was done, the modification was nearly invisible. Unless you knew where to look, you'd never see it. That was intentional. If it failed, he could remove it and no one would know. But if it worked, everything would change. March 1943. The air war over Europe is entering its most desperate phase. The 8th Air Force is flying deep into Germany. The RAF is hitting industrial targets around the clock. Luftwaffe resistance is fierce, coordinated, and adaptive. Fighter Command's role is clear: escort the bombers, intercept enemy formations, and maintain air superiority. But superiority means nothing if your pilots can't see. And increasingly, they can't. The fogging problem is no longer anecdotal, it's statistical. Wing commanders review mission reports and see the same phrases repeated: lost visual contact, unable to identify target, abandoned pursuit due to visibility. In pilot debriefs, the phrase comes up again and again: canopy fogged. Some squadrons lose more aircraft to disorientation than to enemy fire. In one incident, 2 Spitfires collide during a defensive turn in cloud. Both pilots bail out, but one hits the tail on exit. In another, a section leader climbs through overcast, loses sight of his wingmen, and flies into a hillside. There are no bullet holes, just fog. Flight surgeons begin documenting cold injuries: frostbite, hypothermia, nerve damage in fingers and toes, Pilots who fly with canopies cracked for entire sorties return with core body temperatures below 95 degrees. Some can't grip the stick. Some can't speak coherently. They're grounded until they warm up, sometimes for days. Ground crews try improvisation. They wrap cockpit frames in fabric to reduce cold spots. They smear gun oil on the glass. It works for 10 minutes, then smears into a greasy haze. They install makeshift heaters using exhaust bleed air. One catches fire, another cracks the canopy from thermal stress. Engineers at Farnborough run controlled tests in climate chambers. They cycle temperatures, vary humidity, measure dew points. Their conclusion is technically sound, but practically useless. The only reliable way to prevent fogging is to maintain cockpit temperature within 3 degrees of exterior glass temperature, which is impossible at altitude. One proposal suggests installing dual-pane canopies, like insulated windows. The weight penalty is unacceptable. Another suggests chemically treated glass. The optical distortion is unacceptable. A third suggests pilot-breathing tubes that vent exhalation directly overboard. The complexity is unacceptable. Every solution is either too heavy, too expensive, too fragile, or too slow to implement. The war won't wait for perfect engineering. Pilots are dying now. Holloway reads these reports when they filter down to station level. He sees the same pattern. Every proposal treats fogging as a thermodynamic problem. They're trying to change temperature. But temperature is a symptom, not the cause. The real problem is stagnation. Air that doesn't move becomes saturated. Saturated air condenses on cold surfaces. It's not about heat, it's about flow. He wonders why no one is talking about airflow management. Maybe because it's not elegant. Maybe because it doesn't require new materials or exotic chemistry. Maybe because it's too simple to take seriously. Or maybe because no one with the authority to change design has ever sat in a freezing cockpit, breath clouding, altitude rising, and realized they're about to die because of condensation. Holloway knows that feeling. He's never flown combat, but he's flown test hops. He's sat in cockpits during ground runs in January, watched his breath fog the glass, felt the cold seep through his jacket. He understands what it's like to fight your own aircraft. He also understands bureaucracy. The RAF is brilliant at logistics, at coordination, at mass production. But brilliance at scale often means rigidity. It means standardization. It means that a good idea from a maintenance officer at a forward airfield will be reviewed, debated, shelved, and forgotten while men continue to die. Unless the idea proves itself first. Holloway's modification is installed. The Spitfire is buttoned up and returned to the flight line. On paper, it's been repaired and cleared for service. No one has noticed the 1/4-inch slot along the canopy base. No one has asked. Maintenance logs list hydraulic work, a magneto swap, and a routine inspection. Nothing about airflow. Now he needs a test. But he can't just ask a pilot to fly it. If the modification causes a problem, turbulence, structural failure, canopy failure, the pilot could be killed. And Holloway would be responsible. He considers flying it himself. He's rated on single-engine aircraft, but he hasn't flown in months, and he's never flown a Spitfire in combat conditions. If he crashes, the modification is buried and the problem persists. He needs someone who trusts him, someone who understands risk, someone who's frustrated enough with the fogging problem to try something unauthorized. He finds that someone 3 days later. Flight Lieutenant James Cartwright is 24 years old and has 62 combat sorties to his name. He flies with precision and patience, traits that have kept him alive longer than most. But lately, he's been grounded more than he's flown. Not by command, by cold. 2 weeks ago, he escorted bombers to Lille. At 18,000 feet, his canopy fogged during a climbing turn. He cracked it open, cleared his vision, and immediately lost feeling in his left hand. By the time he landed, his fingers were white and wooden. Medical officers grounded him for 4 days. He returned to duty, flew another sortie, and had the same problem. This time he kept the canopy closed and tried to navigate by instrument. He lost his section in cloud and nearly collided with a Wellington. When he landed, he was reprimanded for breaking formation. He didn't argue. He just asked if there was a solution to the fogging. He was told to breathe shallow and keep the canopy cracked. Cartwright is the kind of pilot who doesn't complain. He follows orders. He trusts his aircraft, but he's also the kind who pays attention. He's noticed that the fogging isn't random. It happens at specific altitudes. It worsens during turns. It clears in dives. There's a pattern, and patterns mean there's a solution. When Holloway approaches him in the dispersal hut, Cartwright listens. Holloway doesn't oversell it. He just explains the logic. Air stagnates. Moisture condenses. A controlled gap introduces flow. Flow prevents condensation. Simple. Cartwright asks the obvious question. Has it been tested? Holloway says no. Not in flight, but the physics are sound. Cartwright asks if it's approved. Holloway says no. Cartwright is quiet for a moment. Then he asks which aircraft. Holloway points to the Spitfire on the hardstand, the one with the fresh hydraulic repair. Cartwright walks over, runs his hand along the canopy rail, feels the gap. It's smooth, precise, almost invisible. He looks back at Holloway. He says he'll fly it. Holloway tells him he doesn't have to. If there's a problem, it's on Holloway, not him. Cartwright shakes his head. He's already lost 2 friends to disorientation. If there's a chance this works, it's worth the risk. They agree on a test protocol, a local flight. Climb to 20,000 feet, close the canopy, breathe normally, monitor visibility. If fogging occurs, abort and return. If it doesn't, run through combat maneuvers and see if the effect holds. No paperwork, no official log. Just a routine air test. If anyone asks, it's a post-maintenance check flight. The next morning, conditions are perfect for fogging. Temperature at altitude is forecast at -30. Humidity at ground level is high. The kind of day where condensation is guaranteed. Cartwright suits up. Holloway runs a final walk around, checking control surfaces, fuel load, oxygen. Everything is standard except the canopy. He doesn't mention it to the ground crew. They wouldn't understand, and explaining would mean delays. Cartwright climbs in, straps down, runs through pre-start checks, engine start, gauges green, radio check. Tower clears him for departure. He taxis to the runway, runs up the engine, and releases brakes. The Spitfire accelerates, lifts, climbs into cold gray sky. Holloway watches from the dispersal, binoculars raised, jaw tight. Cartwright levels at 5,000 feet. Canopy closed. He breathes normally, watches the glass. Clear. He climbs to 10,000. Still clear. 15,000. A faint haze appears near the top edge, then dissipates. He feels a faint draft near his left shoulder. Cold, but not painful. Just a whisper of slipstream. 20,000 feet. He runs through a series of hard turns. Port, starboard, climb, dive. His breathing quickens. Normally, this is when the fogging starts. He waits. Nothing. The canopy stays clear, not perfectly spotless, but clear enough. He can see his instruments. He can see the horizon. He can see the fields below, patchwork green and brown through scattered cloud. He can see. He keys the radio and reports altitude, heading, and status. Tower acknowledges. He doesn't mention the visibility. Not yet. He needs to be sure. He stays aloft for 40 minutes. He runs every maneuver he can think of. Loops, rolls, High G turns, simulated intercepts, steep climbs, shallow glides. He breathes hard, deliberately fogging his oxygen mask, forcing moisture into the cockpit air. The canopy remains clear. He descends, enters the circuit, and lands. As he taxis back, he sees Holloway standing by the hardstand, arms crossed, face unreadable. Cartwright cuts the engine, slides the canopy back, and climbs out. He pulls off his helmet. His face is cold but not frozen. His hands are functional. His vision was perfect the entire flight. He looks at Holloway and says 2 words. It worked. Holloway doesn't celebrate. He listens to Cartwright's debrief, takes notes, asks detailed questions. At what altitude did you first notice the draft? Was there any turbulence? Could you hear the airflow? Did it affect control feel? Was the cold tolerable? Cartwright answers each one. The draft was noticeable but not disruptive. No turbulence. A faint whistling sound at high speed, barely audible over the engine. Controls felt normal. The cold was present, but manageable. Far better than flying with the canopy fully cracked. Holloway's mind is already running through the next steps. One successful test proves the concept, but it doesn't prove reliability. He needs data, multiple flights, different pilots, different conditions. He needs to know if the modification works in rain, in combat stress, in sustained climbs, but he also knows he's on borrowed time. If command finds out he's altering airframes without authorization, the project ends and he ends up in front of a disciplinary board. He needs proof strong enough to override protocol. That means he needs more pilots willing to fly the modified aircraft. Cartwright volunteers to spread the word quietly. He talks to 2 other flight lieutenants, both of whom have had fogging incidents. They agree to fly test hops. Within a week, 5 pilots have flown the modified Spitfire. All report the same result. Clear canopy, tolerable cold, no operational impact. One pilot, a Canadian named McKay, takes it into a mock dogfight with an unmodified aircraft. He outturns his opponent 3 times, not because of skill, but because he can see continuously, while the other pilot has to crack his canopy mid-engagement. McKay lands and tells Holloway he wants the same modification on his assigned aircraft. Holloway hesitates. Modifying one grounded airframe is one thing. Modifying operational fighters assigned to specific pilots is another. But McKay is insistent. He argues that if the modification improves combat effectiveness, withholding it is a greater risk than implementing it. Holloway agrees. He works at night, modifying McKay's aircraft and 2 others. The cuts are clean, the deflectors fitted with precision. Each installation takes 90 minutes. By the end of the week, 4 Spitfires in the squadron have the modification. Officially, maintenance logs show routine inspections. Unofficially, a quiet revolution is underway. Pilots begin to notice. The modified aircraft are in higher demand. Flight assignments start to favor them. During mission briefs, pilots ask which aircraft has the gap. Some call it the Holloway mod. Others just call it the fix. The squadron's engineering officer eventually notices something. He's reviewing fuel consumption data and sees slight discrepancies in airspeed readings on certain aircraft. Not enough to indicate malfunction, but enough to suggest altered drag profiles. He inspects one of the modified Spitfires and finds the gap. He brings it to Holloway, asks what it is, asks who authorized it. Holloway tells him the truth. No one authorized it. It's a field modification to solve the fogging problem. It's been tested. It works. Pilots want it. The engineering officer is caught between regulation and results. He knows unauthorized modifications are forbidden. He also knows the fogging problem is killing pilots. He tells Holloway he's required to report it. But he also tells him he'll delay the report for 48 hours. That gives Holloway time to escalate it himself, to present it as a solution rather than a violation. Holloway drafts a report. He includes test flight data, pilot testimony, and technical diagrams. He describes the problem, the solution, and the results. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't ask for leniency. He just presents the facts and requests formal evaluation. He submits it to the station commander. 2 days later, he's summoned to the commander's office. He expects reprimand. Instead, he finds 3 men waiting: the station commander, a senior engineer from Farnborough, and a wing commander from Fighter Command Headquarters. They've read his report. They've inspected the modified aircraft. They've spoken to the pilots. They have questions. The Farnborough engineer asks about structural integrity. Has the canopy frame been weakened? Holloway explains that the gap is cut into the rail, not the frame. Load-bearing structures are untouched. Stress testing on the ground showed no degradation. The wing commander asks about cold exposure. Are pilots at risk of hypothermia? Holloway provides temperature data from test flights. Cockpit temps dropped by an average of 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Tolerable with standard flight gear. Far better than open canopies. The station commander asks the most important question: does it work in combat? Holloway presents testimony from McKay and 2 others who've flown combat sorties with the modification. All report sustained visibility, no fogging, and no operational drawbacks. One pilot intercepted a Focke-Wulf he wouldn't have seen otherwise. Another stayed with his formation through cloud when he would have been forced to break off. The men exchange glances. The Farnborough engineer asks how quickly the modification can be implemented across the fleet. Holloway estimates 1 hour per aircraft. Minimal material cost. No special tools. Any qualified rigger can do it. The wing commander leans back. He says something that changes everything. He says they're going to test it formally. 10 aircraft, 2 squadrons, operational conditions. If results match field reports, the modification will be rolled out to Fighter Command. But there's a condition. Holloway will supervise installation and training. He'll travel to each station, brief maintenance crews, and ensure consistency. If it works, he'll be credited. If it fails, he'll be held accountable. Holloway agrees without hesitation. Within 2 weeks, 20 aircraft are modified. Within a month, 200. By June 1943, over 400 Spitfires across Fighter Command have the Holloway gap. Pilots stop cracking their canopies. Cold injuries drop. Visibility incidents decrease by 70%. But the real measure of success isn't in statistics. It's in the missions that don't fail, the intercepts that succeed, the pilots who come home because they could see. The Holloway modification spreads faster than official channels intended. Word moves through squadrons, station to station, pilot to pilot. Ground crews hear about it from maintainers. Maintainers hear about it from riggers. Riggers start making the cuts without waiting for formal orders. By autumn 1943, the modification is standard on most frontline Spitfires. It's added to new production airframes. Supermarine incorporates it into factory specs. What began as an unauthorized field fix becomes official doctrine. The impact is measurable. Between April and December 1943, Fighter Command records a 42% reduction in visibility-related incidents compared to the previous winter. Collision rates drop. Disorientation cases drop. Cold injuries drop. Pilot confidence rises. Wing commanders notice something else. Sortie completion rates improve. Pilots stay on station longer. They maintain visual contact in weather that previously would have forced them to abort. Bomber escort missions become more effective because fighters can hold formation through cloud. Luftwaffe intelligence notices too. German pilots report that RAF fighters are maintaining contact more aggressively in poor visibility. The tactic of baiting Spitfires into climbs and losing them in cloud becomes less effective. Engagement outcomes shift. One Luftwaffe report, captured later in the war, notes that RAF tactics in late 1943 became noticeably more aggressive in winter conditions. The report speculates improved training or better instrumentation. It doesn't mention the quarter-inch gap that made the difference. The modification saves lives in ways that can't be quantified. There are intercepts that succeed because a pilot saw the enemy a second earlier. There are collisions that don't happen because a wingman stayed visible. There are pilots who land safely because they could see the runway through freezing mist. One pilot, a New Zealander named Carter, writes in his diary about a mission over the North Sea. Heavy overcast. Temperature at -28. Canopy clear the entire flight. He writes that it felt like a small miracle. He writes that he thought of the rigger who'd made the cut and hoped someone thanked him. Holloway never seeks recognition. He's promoted to squadron leader, assigned to a technical liaison role, and spends the rest of the war traveling between stations, troubleshooting modifications and advising on field engineering. He works quietly, methodically, the same way he always has. But pilots remember. Ground crews remember. After the war, when veterans gather and talk about what kept them alive, Holloway's name comes up, not as a hero, as a solver, the man who noticed what everyone else missed. In 1947, the Royal Aeronautical Society publishes a technical paper on cockpit airflow management. It credits Holloway's modification as a foundational example of passive environmental control. The paper is dry, academic, and precise. It never mentions the night shifts, the unauthorized cuts, or the risk he took. But it acknowledges the result. A simple gap, a controlled draft, and the thousands of missions it made possible. Peter Holloway left the RAF in 1946. He returned to Coventry, took a position with an engineering firm, and spent the next 20 years designing industrial ventilation systems. He never worked on aircraft again. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he'd mention his role as a maintenance officer, the long hours, the cold. If pressed about the canopy modification, he'd shrug and say it was just common sense. He'd say someone would have thought of it eventually. But pilots who survived the war knew better. They knew that common sense isn't common in war, that logic under pressure is rare, that the willingness to break rules to save lives is rarer still. In 1968, a group of former RAF pilots organized a reunion at Tangmere. They invited Holloway. He attended quietly, sat in the back, listened to stories. At the end of the evening, one pilot stood and raised a glass. He said that many of them wouldn't be there if not for a maintenance officer who believed a quarter-inch gap could change the war. The room stood. Holloway didn't. He just nodded, uncomfortable with the attention, and thanked them for their service. He passed away in 1979 at 71 in the same town where he was born. His obituary mentioned his engineering career, his service in the RAF, and his quiet demeanor. It didn't mention fogging or Spitfires or the innovation that saved hundreds of lives. But in the archives of the RAF Museum, in a file labeled Field Modifications 1943, there's a memorandum. It's from a wing commander to the Air Ministry dated May 1943. It recommends that Warrant Officer Peter Holloway be commended for initiative and technical ingenuity in solving a critical operational problem. Below that, in a different hand, someone has written a single line. This man saw what we did not. The Holloway Gap remains a case study in military academies. It's taught in engineering schools as an example of elegant problem-solving. It's referenced in manuals on human factors and environmental design. But more than that, it's a reminder. War is fought with machinery, but it's won by people who refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable, people who trust their eyes more than doctrine, people who believe that a small change made at the right time can shift the balance. Holloway didn't invent new materials, he didn't design a new aircraft. He just looked at a problem everyone else had accepted, and he refused to accept it. He saw condensation where others saw inevitability. He saw airflow where others saw only cold. He saw a solution where others saw only regulations. And because of that, thousands of pilots flew home through winter skies with clear canopies, steady hands, and a fighting chance. Not every hero flies. Some stand on the ground, file in hand, and quietly change the war. The Spitfire came in crooked. No aileron control, no way to level the wings. The right wingtip dragged low, scraping air like a wounded bird trying not to fall. Every pilot on the field knew what happened next. You stalled, you cartwheeled, you burned. But the man in the cockpit had trained for this moment, using a technique the RAF had ridiculed for 2 years. Now, with his crew watching and fuel running dry, he would prove that sometimes the madman is right. England, spring of 1943. The air smells of wet grass and engine oil. At RAF Duxford, the sound of Merlin engines rises and falls in waves, a mechanical hymn that never quite ends. Pilots walk in small clusters, their faces young but their eyes older than their years. They wear Mae Wests over wool uniforms. Their hands are stained with hydraulic fluid and tobacco. They laugh, but not too loud. Everyone knows the numbers. Bomber Command is losing crews faster than they can be replaced. Fighter Command is stretched thin over the Channel, over France, over the North Sea. Every sortie is a wager with physics and luck. In the operations room, maps are pinned with red string. Routes, targets, loss estimates. The walls are painted a dull green that swallows light. Someone has written a joke on the chalkboard, but no one remembers what it means anymore. Outside, ground crews work in the cold. They patch bullet holes with aluminum and hope. They replace shattered canopies. They load ammunition belts by hand, round by brass round, knowing that each one might be the difference between a pilot coming home or not. The training regimen is brutal. New pilots get 30 hours if they're lucky. Then they're thrown into combat against Luftwaffe veterans who have been flying since Spain. The attrition rate is mathematical, predictable, unbearable, so the RAF focuses on what it can control: formation flying, gunnery, navigation, emergency procedures. But there is one scenario they don't teach, one failure mode considered too rare, too complex, too deadly to waste time on: total aileron failure. If you lose your ailerons, you lose roll control. You can't level your wings. You can't correct for crosswinds. You can't land. The official guidance is simple: bail out. Let the aircraft go. Save yourself. No pilot has ever successfully landed a fighter with no aileron authority. The physics are considered impossible, but there is a man at Duxford who disagrees. His name is Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson, though everyone calls him Nick. He is 31, which makes him ancient by fighter pilot standards. He has a narrow face, a sharp nose, and hands that never stop moving when he talks. He flies Spitfires, and he flies them differently than anyone else. He uses one hand on the stick. The other rests on the throttle or the trim wheel, making constant micro-adjustments. It looks unorthodox. It looks lazy. It looks wrong. Other pilots mock him for it. They say he's compensating for bad technique. They say he's showing off. They say he'll get himself killed. Nicholson doesn't argue. He just keeps flying. And he keeps thinking about a problem no one else seems to care about. What happens when the controls fail? What happens when doctrine has no answer? What happens when the only choice is between dying by the book or living by breaking it? If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Before the war, Nicholson was an engineer, not the glamorous kind, the kind who worked in factories, solving problems no one noticed until something broke. He grew up in Bradford, in the north of England, where the sky was always grey and the mills never stopped. His father worked in textiles. His mother died when he was 12. He learned early that the world didn't care about your feelings. It cared about whether you could fix the loom before the shift ended. He was good with his hands, good with systems. He understood that machines were just logic made physical. If you could map the logic, you could predict the failure. If you could predict the failure, you could prevent it, or survive it. He joined the RAF in 1937, not out of patriotism, but out of curiosity. He wanted to understand how aircraft worked, how they stayed in the air, how they didn't fall. Flight school bored him. The instructors taught by rote. Do this, don't do that. Follow the checklist. But Nicholson wanted to know why. Why did you need two hands on the stick during aerobatics? Why couldn't you use trim to do the same job? Why was the doctrine written as if every failure happened in isolation, when real emergencies were always compounded, always chaotic, always worse than the manual said? He started experimenting. Small things at first. Flying with one hand, using rudder and throttle to control roll instead of ailerons. Feeling how the aircraft responded when you stopped fighting it and started negotiating with it. His instructors noticed. They didn't approve. One of them wrote in his file that Nicholson had unorthodox habits that may prove dangerous in combat situations. Another wrote that he lacks discipline and fails to adhere to established technique. Nicholson didn't care. He passed his exams. He earned his wings. He was assigned to a fighter squadron and sent to France in 1940, just in time for the fall. He flew Hurricanes over the retreat. He saw Stukas diving through flak. He saw Messerschmitts slashing through bomber formations like wolves through sheep. He saw good pilots die because they did exactly what they were trained to do. And he saw bad pilots survive because they ignored the rules and made it up as they went. He came back to England with a conviction. The doctrine was incomplete. It prepared you for the expected. But war was a series of unexpected failures. If you wanted to survive, you had to train for the impossible. You had to know your aircraft so well that you could fly it even when half the controls were gone. You had to become the system. You had to think like the machine. So he kept practicing. One hand on the stick, the other on the throttle, the trim, the mixture. He learned to use asymmetric thrust to induce roll. He learned to use rudder to counter adverse yaw. He learned to feel the edge of a stall through the seat of his pants, not through the stick. It felt wrong, it felt inefficient, but it worked. And more importantly, it gave him options. When other pilots had one way to solve a problem, Nicholson had three. No one cared, no one asked. He was just the odd one, the old one, the one who flew with one hand and didn't drink much at the pub and spent his evenings sketching control diagrams in a notebook no one ever saw. By 1943, the war in the air has changed. The Luftwaffe is no longer the invincible force it was in 1940, but it is still lethal, still disciplined, still capable of killing you if you make one mistake. Fighter sweeps over France are daily. Bomber escorts are constant. The attrition is relentless, and the aircraft are being pushed beyond their design limits. Engines overheat, hydraulic lines rupture, control cables fray. Pilots are told to nurse their machines home. But some failures can't be nursed. Aileron failure is rare, but it happens. A stray round cuts the cable, a hydraulic line bursts, a control rod shears under G-load. When it does, the pilot has seconds to decide. Bail out or try to bring it in. The doctrine is clear. Bail out. But bail out means losing the aircraft. It means losing the intelligence from the gun camera. It means losing the engineering data from the damage assessment. And it means the enemy knows you're coming down. If you're over France, you're a prisoner. If you're over the Channel, you're probably dead. So some pilots try. They try to land without ailerons. They use rudder to keep the wings level. They try to time the flare so the aircraft settles evenly on both wheels. It never works. The aircraft skids. It ground loops. The wingtip catches and the whole machine cartwheels in a shower of sparks and fuel. If you're lucky, you walk away. If you're not, you burn. Nicholson has watched 3 pilots try, 3 pilots fail. He has studied the wreckage. He has read the accident reports, and he has concluded that the problem is not the aircraft. The problem is the technique. The doctrine says to use rudder to control roll, but rudder is a poor substitute for ailerons. It's slow, it's imprecise, it induces yaw, which induces slip, which makes the aircraft harder to control. The more you use rudder, the worse it gets. It's a feedback loop that ends in a crash. But there is another way. Nicholson has tested it in his head 100 times. Instead of using rudder to force the wings level, you use throttle and trim to balance the lift. You accept that the aircraft will come in crooked. You don't fight it. You manage it. You use asymmetric thrust to keep the low wing from dropping further. You use elevator trim to control descent rate without overpitching. You time the flare so the high wheel touches first, then let the low wheel settle as the speed bleeds off. It's not a landing, it's a controlled crash, but it's survivable. He tries to explain it to his squadron leader. The man listens politely, then shakes his head. If you lose your ailerons, you bail out. That's the procedure. Nicholson pushes back. The procedure assumes the aircraft is uncontrollable. But it's not. It's just difficult. The squadron leader frowns. And you think you can do it? Nicholson nods. I think someone should try. The squadron leader stands. Not in one of my Spitfires. We don't have aircraft to spare for experiments. So Nicholson stops, asking. He keeps flying. He keeps practicing his one-hand technique. He keeps sketching his diagrams. And he waits, because he knows that sooner or later someone will need what he knows. Someone will face the impossible problem, and when they do, he will be ready. The call comes on a Thursday afternoon in late May. The weather is clear. The mission is a routine fighter sweep over Abbeville. Nicholson is not flying. He's in the ops room, updating the status board, when the radio crackles. It's red section. 3 Spitfires. They've been bounced by 109s. One of them is hit. The voice on the radio is calm, but tight. Red 3 has taken fire. Control surfaces damaged. Ailerons non-responsive. There is a pause, then the voice again. Attempting to return to base. The room goes quiet. Everyone knows what that means. The squadron leader keys the mic. Red 3, state your position and altitude. The reply comes back. 10 miles south of Dover, 8,000 feet. Wings are not level. I can maintain heading, but I cannot correct roll. The squadron leader looks at the map, then at the weather report, then at Nicholson. He's got maybe 10 minutes before he has to decide. Nicholson steps forward. Let me talk to him. The squadron leader hesitates. What are you going to tell him? Nicholson holds his gaze. How to land it. The room is silent. The squadron leader hands him the mic. Nicholson presses the transmit button. Red 3, this is Duxford. You can bring her in, but you need to do exactly what I say. There is a long pause. Then the voice comes back, uncertain. I've got no aileron authority. The book says to bail. Nicholson keeps his voice level. The book assumes you can't control roll, but you can. Not with ailerons, with power and trim. Another pause. I'm listening. Nicholson talks him through it. Slowly, clearly. Check your fuel. Check your hydraulics. Confirm elevator and rudder response. Good. Now reduce speed to 140. Use throttle to keep the low wing from dropping. Not rudder. Throttle. If the right wing is low, reduce power slightly. Let the left wing generate more lift. It's counterintuitive, but it works. The pilot tries it. It's working. The wing is coming up. Nicholson nods, though the pilot can't see him. Good. Now hold that. Don't overcorrect. Small inputs, constant adjustments. The squadron leader is watching. He's never going to make the runway like this. Nicholson doesn't look away from the radio. He doesn't need to make it pretty. He just needs to make it. The Spitfire crosses the coast. The pilot calls out his altitude. 5,000 feet. 4,000. The airfield is in sight. Nicholson keeps talking. When you start your approach, accept that you're coming in with one wing low. Don't fight it. Manage your descent rate with trim, not stick. You want a shallow glide, no sudden movements. The pilot acknowledges. His breathing is audible now. Fast, shallow. Nicholson softens his tone. You've done the hard part. Now it's just a landing. You've done 1,000 of them. But everyone in the room knows that's not true. No one has done this landing. No one has survived it. And if it goes wrong fast. The Spitfire appears as a dot above the tree line. It grows slowly, unevenly, the right wing canted down at 15 degrees. The aircraft looks drunk. It looks broken. It looks like it should not be in the air. On the ground, fire crews are already moving into position. Ambulances idle near the threshold. The tower has cleared all other traffic. The sky belongs to Red 3. Nicholson stands outside the ops room, watching through binoculars. The squadron leader is beside him. Neither speaks. The Spitfire is at 500 feet. 400. The pilot has reduced speed to just above stall. The engine note is uneven. Throttle adjustments, constant corrections. The right wing is still low, but it's not dropping. It's holding. Barely. 300 feet. The pilot begins his flare. Too early and he'll stall. Too late and he'll slam into the runway. Nicholson holds his breath. The nose comes up. The speed bleeds off. The right wing dips further. For a moment it looks like the whole aircraft will cartwheel, but then the right wheel touches, gently, just kissing the concrete. The pilot holds it there, letting the weight settle, letting the speed decay. The left wheel is still in the air. The aircraft is balanced on one gear and a prayer. 2 seconds. 3. The tail comes down. The left wheel touches. The Spitfire wobbles, skids slightly, then straightens. The pilot cuts the engine. The propeller windmills to a stop. The aircraft rolls to a halt halfway down the runway. For a moment, nothing happens. Then the canopy slides back. The pilot climbs out. His legs are shaking. He sits down on the wing and puts his head in his hands. The fire crews arrive. The ambulance crew checks him over. He's fine, not a scratch. The ground crew swarms the aircraft, inspecting the damage. The aileron cables are severed cleanly. Both sides. No hydraulic pressure, no mechanical linkage. The ailerons are just dead weight hanging from the wings. By every measure, the aircraft should not have been controllable. But it was. Nicholson walks out to the runway. The pilot sees him coming and stands. "You're the one on the radio." Nicholson nods. The pilot extends a hand. "I thought I was dead." Nicholson shakes it. "You did the hard part. You trusted the logic." The pilot looks at the Spitfire. "How did you know that would work?" Nicholson shrugs. "I didn't. But the math said it should." The squadron leader approaches. He looks at the aircraft. He looks at Nicholson. "You've done this before." Nicholson shakes his head. "No, but I've thought about it." The squadron leader is quiet for a moment. "I want you to write it down, every step. We need to add it to the training syllabus." Nicholson almost smiles. "I tried to tell you 2 months ago." The squadron leader doesn't flinch. "And now I'm listening." Word spreads fast. By evening, half the base knows the story. By the next day, the Air Ministry is asking questions. They want data. They want diagrams. They want proof that this wasn't just luck. Nicholson provides it. He writes a 14-page technical memo describing the physics of asymmetric thrust control. He includes diagrams, calculations, step-by-step procedures. He submits it through channels. 3 weeks later, it's classified as restricted training material. Copies are distributed to every fighter squadron in the RAF. It's added to the Emergency Procedures Manual. Instructors begin teaching it at flight school. It's called the Nicholson technique. Some pilots mock it. They say it's too complex, too risky. But the ones who need it don't mock it. The ones who face the impossible problem and survive, they remember. And they teach it to the next pilot, and the next. Over the next 2 years, 11 RAF pilots successfully land aircraft with total aileron failure using Nicholson's method. 11 aircraft are saved. 11 pilots walk away. Not all of them know his name, but they all know the technique, and they all know that someone, somewhere, thought about the impossible and decided it was merely difficult. The ripple effect is not immediate, it's not dramatic, but it's measurable. Aircraft attrition rates drop by a fraction of a percent. It doesn't sound like much, but across thousands of sorties, it means dozens of pilots who don't have to bail out over enemy territory. Dozens of aircraft that return to service instead of being written off. Dozens of intelligence reports from gun camera footage that would have been lost. The data is compiled in a report by Bomber Command in late 1944. It notes that emergency landing success rates have improved significantly since the introduction of revised control failure procedures. It doesn't mention Nicholson by name. It doesn't need to. The people who matter know. Fighter tactics begin to shift. Pilots are trained to think beyond the checklist, to understand the systems, not just the procedures, to see control failure not as a death sentence, but as a problem with solutions. The culture changes, slowly, from rigid adherence to doctrine toward flexible problem-solving. It's not a revolution. It's an evolution. But it saves lives. In 1945, an American P-51 pilot lands at an emergency strip in Belgium with no aileron control. He uses asymmetric throttle and trim. He walks away. When asked how he knew what to do, he says he read about it in a manual. He doesn't know who wrote it. In 1952, a test pilot at Farnborough uses the technique to recover from a control flutter incident that should have been fatal. He survives. The incident report cites application of asymmetric thrust recovery procedure per RAF Technical Memo 2117-43. That memo is Nicholson's. By the 1950s, the technique is standard. It's taught to civilian pilots. It's adapted for jets. It becomes part of the baseline assumption of what is possible. And like all good engineering, it becomes invisible. No one remembers that there was a time when it didn't exist. No one remembers that it was considered impossible. No one remembers the man who proved otherwise. Nicholson survives the war. He returns to civilian life in 1946. He works as an aeronautical consultant, helping design control systems for the new generation of jet aircraft. He never seeks recognition. He never writes a memoir. He is occasionally invited to speak at RAF training schools, where he talks not about heroism, but about systems thinking, about understanding failure modes, about the importance of questioning assumptions. He dies in 1968 at the age of 56 of a heart attack. His obituary in the Times is 3 paragraphs. It mentions his wartime service. It does not mention the technique that bears his name. At his funeral, 4 former pilots attend. They do not know each other, but they each tell the same story. They each say that Nicholson saved their life, not personally, but through an idea, through a method, through a refusal to accept that some problems have no solution. In the decades that follow, the Nicholson technique is studied, refined, and eventually superseded by fly-by-wire systems that make mechanical control failure nearly impossible. But the principle remains. When systems fail, there is usually a way. It requires calm, it requires logic, it requires the courage to try what others say cannot be done. In 2003, a commercial airline pilot suffers a hydraulic failure over the Atlantic. He has no aileron authority. He uses differential thrust to control the aircraft. He lands safely at Shannon. When investigators ask how he knew to do that, he says it's in the manual. It's been in the manual since the 1940s. He doesn't know who wrote it first. The lesson is this: wars are won by logistics and strategy and firepower, but they are also won by the quiet engineer who thinks about what happens when everything goes wrong, by the pilot who practices what no one else thinks is worth practicing, by the one who refuses to accept that impossible means impossible. Nicholson did not win the war, but he proved that survival is often a matter of preparation, meeting imagination. That authority is not always right. That doctrine is a starting point, not a ceiling. And that sometimes the difference between life and death is a single idea, tested once, shared quietly, and passed down through generations who never learn the name of the man who thought of it first. His legacy is not in medals or monuments. It is in every pilot who lands when they should have fallen, in every emergency checklist that includes the impossible, in every life saved by someone who refused to stop thinking when the book ran out of answers.